Chapter 12. Jammin's Story. All that night and all the next day they traveled, pausing only long enough to eat. Late in the evening they reached a cleft in the rock. Here they stopped to rest and sleep. They had not been attacked again during their rapid march, though once their swords had told them that the enemy's scouts were near. But at the cleft of the rock they could rest without fear. They slept and ate and slept again. And during the quiet hours between sleep, they talked over their recent adventures. Waver told them of how he had been captured and made to march, blindfolded and with his hands tied, all the way to Castle Despair. There, he said, they threw me into a dungeon where you found me. I was given food which contained some sort of drug which weakened me, and twice daily one of the chiefs of the evil ones would visit me and tell me terrible falsehoods about the king and the Brotherhood. He told me that, because of my failure at the outpost, my name had been stricken from the roll of the king's soldiers, and that nothing would be done, now or ever, to rescue me. Even though I knew it could not be true, I was on the point of believing it after a while. "What a terrible thing!" burst out Lannis. "Jammin, why don't the king's soldiers march in a body and destroy the Castle of Despair and all who live in it?" "We cannot," said Jammin from his seat against the cave wall. "We have not the strength, nor is that our mission. The king has given us the weapons to resist and defeat the enemy wherever and whenever we meet him, but it is decreed that the castles of evil will remain until the king returns to reign. Then he will lead us against these strongholds and conquer them once and for all. In the meantime, these enemies are to test us so that we will learn how to use the king's weapons." Robin, who had been lying full length on the cave floor, raised himself on his elbow. "Jammin," he said, "you told us that once you too were imprisoned in Castle Despair. Will you tell us about it?" "Yes, I will," said Jammin, "for you may perhaps learn by my mistakes." He stretched his short legs out before him, leaning back comfortably against the wall, and began. "As a young soldier, I was sometimes lazy. One summer day, while on a mission for the king down in the valley, I fell asleep under a tree." Here Jammin looked at Lannis, and that young man remembered his own shortcomings and blushed deeply. "When I awoke, it was after dark, and I had been bound hand and foot by a group of the enemy. They had taken my sword and shield from me, and were carrying me on their shoulders. First they took me to Castle Doubt, which stands in an area of quicksand at the edge of the valley. Here they stuffed me with strange fruits in an effort to make me dissatisfied with my memories of the king's food. They also brought to my cell men who claimed to be former soldiers of the king, who had seen the error of their ways. These persons told me how much happier they had been since leaving the king's service, and tried to convince me to renounce my allegiance. I have since learned that none of them were ever truly soldiers. After some weeks in this castle, the enemy took me to Castle Despair, where I was put in the same cell as Waver. Here they told me I would stay until I agreed to turn from the king and serve them. They promised me that if I would turn to their side, they would send me further down the valley to Castle Unbelief, where, they said, were all kinds of pleasures, and I should live at my ease for the rest of my life. I grew more and more discouraged as time went on, and several times thought of taking my own life. Then one day my chief tormentor came to my cell with another of the evil ones. They had with them, in addition to their own weapons, my sword and shield. Evidently the evil ones had been curious about our weapons. After getting mine into their hands, they had tried to see how they were used. But in the hands of the enemy, the shield immediately became tarnished, and the sword was dull and pointless. So they brought them to my cell to show me how much inferior they were to their own weapons. "See how tarnished they are," they said. "We have tried to cut with the sword and have found that it is no good at all. Men armed with swords like this can never conquer us. Turn from this foolish soldiering and join the ranks of evil." Then I saw my opportunity. I was weak and sick, and there were 2 against 1. But if I could get my hands on the sword, perhaps the king would give me strength to strike. I told them I did not believe that the blade was dull, and asked them to show me. One of them drew the edge across a piece of cloth, holding the sword close so that I could see it in the flickering light of the candle. I lifted my heart in a silent prayer for strength. Then, with all the effort I could muster, I threw myself forward, seizing the sword away from him. In my hand it came to life. Before he could recover, I thrust the sword into his heart. As he fell, I snatched the shield of faith. Then the other one hurled himself on me, and we battled back and forth across the narrow room. In my weak condition, I would soon have been overcome, but the sword and shield fought for me, seeming to lift themselves until finally my tormentor fell. I rested, trembling from weakness. There was no sound from outside the locked door. None of the others had heard, but I had no way to break out. Then it was that I noticed that the keyhole in the dungeon door was the same size and shape as my sword blade, and I tried thrusting the blade through it. The dungeon door opened. As I began wandering through the passages looking for a way of escape, I found that my sword, which I carried drawn in my hand, was leading me forward. I followed and found the same side door which we entered the castle to rescue Waver. In this lock my sword worked again, and I was able to strike down the guard and escape across the causeway. So you see, concluded Jamin, smiling, why I was chosen to lead this expedition. Even our failures as soldiers of the king can sometimes be used to help others who have fallen in the same snare. Remember that, Waver, and you too, Lannis. Be thankful for deliverance from failure, and be quick to help others who fail. Jamin and Lannis sat together in the silence for a while after the others were asleep. Lannis, with his knees drawn up beneath his chin, was thinking over the events of the past few days. Finally he said, Jamin, there is one thing that is troubling me. What is it? The face of one of the evil ones. Do you remember several months ago when I told you of going out with a rescue party in the forest and having my first bout with the enemy? Well, I remember that evil one well. He was one of the largest that I have ever seen, and he looked at me with eyes filled with hate. That fight ended before either of us had touched the other, but last night I saw him again. I'm sure now that it was he who knocked me into the lake. Afterwards, he was in the forefront of the battle on the causeway and again in the ravine. I wounded him, but couldn't kill him. And now as I think of him, it comes to me that he was also one of the two who attacked Robin and me on the night when I came to the castle for the first time. Jamin, why do I continue to meet this same fiend? Jamin's face was sober. Your meeting was no accident, my boy. Many of the king's soldiers have a single evil one which pursues them. The name of your enemy is besetting sin. And what the weakness in your life which he attacks may be, only you know. You may wound him often, and you can always, if you use your sword and shield right, beat him in each encounter, but you may never succeed in destroying him. He is not an adversary to be despised. He will grow more skilled in attacking you as you grow skilled in defeating him. He will learn your own strokes with the sword and use them against you. Only rarely does one of the king's soldiers completely succeed in ridding himself of a besetting sin, and that after many years of effort. So watch for him. Don't be afraid of him, for through the sword of the Spirit you can win the victory. And at last, when the king comes again, your adversary will fall forever in that final battle, for so has the king promised. With a final friendly pat on Lannis's shoulder, Jamin rolled himself in his cloak and slept. But Lannis sat long with his chin cupped in his hands, thinking of what he had heard.